Hello and welcome. In this video, we're going to take a look at our current P7 practice. This particular version of our P7 practice focuses on a project that we have worked on now in a couple of iterations. That is our Kiosk products or inventory manager. The idea is that perhaps you own a small business, maybe on an online business or even a brick and mortar store, and you have an inventory that you would ultimately like your application to keep track of. Now, we've went through a couple of iterations of this project. We started first with our static memory declaration, in which we capped off our arrays, and for that matter, any of our arrays of structures or otherwise, to 100 elements. Then we move the project forward by allowing the use of malloc and realloc. Our P7 is supposed to take this project even further and to start leveraging some of our functions that we have written in the earlier iterations. The purpose behind this video is just to get us started on that process. My intention with this project is I'm going to continue to grow this over a long series of videos, if anything, just using this particular project as a platform for adding additional practical functionality for other projects. In other words, you may not see exactly what I'm doing in this video or in this series in your project, but rather similarities to your project. So to begin with, what I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about the P7 project, where it currently stands, and then where we're going to go with it immediately. And so to begin with, what I've done is I've effectively leveraged our P6 modified, which again was the one that used our malloc and our realloc. And what I want to do is I want to focus on what I have brought over and get started on some of the concepts or ideas that we are going to be handling then in this P7 project series. So to begin with, you'll notice that I have the import products function that we created in our P6 modified. It simply allows for you to read a CSV file and essentially import from that CSV file into an array of structures that we are calling import results. Now, as a quick reminder, I want to point out not only the structure itself is comprised of ID, name, type, description, price, and quantity. And we again may add to these in later videos. But I also want to point out the CSV file that is essentially the root of this project. In other words, the purpose of this project. And the idea is that you have a CSV file or comma separated values that will allow for you to manage your inventory. And again, those fields in the CSV file correspond to the fields in the structure, namely the ID, the name of the product, the type of the product, a description, which you've noticed I am separating the fields in the description with semicolons, not with commas, in order that allows for me to be able to keep the number of columns in the CSV file that are separated by commas consistent. And then I also have the price of the product as well as the inventory on hand. And again, the purpose of the import products function is just simply to bring in all of those products into an array of structures. The other thing to note is because we're going to be using malloc and realloc for this entire series, then in this case, I'm passing it the address of the beginning of the array of structures, which means that I can grow the array inside the import function. Now, continuing on, you'll see that I've written a number of helper functions, particularly our display product and display products. Again, the plural here in display products means that this function is essentially just simply driving the singular or the display product to display all of the products in the array. Likewise, with the copy products plural and the copy products singular, that will allow for you to pass an array, then that will simply drive then the copy product function to display a singular product. And then lastly, we have our export products function, which simply allows for us to store perhaps a subset of our inventory in a different file name. Again, we are providing the file name, and then we are providing the array of structures that we wish to export out of our application. And the idea is that we want to keep the same file format that we did in our import, but simply then allow for us to export. Now, before we go any further, let's think about some of the advantages of this modular approach, in that we can then reuse some of these functions for multiple different purposes. A good example of this that we've not yet covered in our earlier videos is that our export products can essentially be used to create a backup version of our current inventory. Maybe, for instance, you're wanting to test an application feature. Well, the first step that you might want to do is simply import the existing contents of the file without making any changes. You simply export it to a backup copy. Now, true enough, this can be done in your file system explorer. However, though, that would not be an automated process. In this case, you could simply leverage your export products as a first step into any other process that you wish to do. In other words, maybe before you add a new product, you simply make a backup copy of your inventory. Now, moving on, I just want to recap some of the additional functions that we've already created, and that is our search structs by double range, which allows for us to search an array of product properties structures, looking at a specific field name, and then looking for the min and max, or rather values between the min and max inclusive, and then simply returning an integer array of indices that match inside our search structs. In other words, basically it tells us roughly the element in the structure that matched the condition. Likewise, we can do the same thing now with our search structs by string exact, which looks at the field name, or rather the values in that field name, and looks for an exact match based on what the user passed to your application. And then likewise, we can look at the string similar, which does something relatively close to the string exact, but the difference being is it looks at a subset of the field name. In other words, you could think of this as a like or a partial match. And again, all three of these functions then simply return the indices of the matched items, which again can be used in conjunction with one of our other functions. Now, I'm not going to build any functions or write any functions in this particular video, but I do want to sort of show you where we're going to start going with this series. And particularly, I want the ability then to get the product interactively, perhaps for the purposes of adding a product to our inventory. And I want to be able to get that from the user by prompting the user for things like the ID, the name, the type, description, and so on. I also want the ability to be able to get from the user parametrically, in other words, from the command line, the fields that would correspond to a new product, or maybe even a product to remove. Again, we're going to be looking at a number of different scenarios in these videos. And then likewise, I may have some other source that I wish to get the product from. In other words, maybe you have some sort of master list from a vendor that you wish to parse. And again, we're not necessarily going to be writing this function, but this is going to be more of a jumping off point for additional functions that would allow for us to get the product from another source. And again, another example of a function that we might find valuable is this validate function, where we actually look at an individual structure, perhaps inside of an array of structures, or even a structure that was created interactively or parametrically, and we simply put all of our logic inside of this function to determine whether or not that structure is a valid product. In other words, this is where you could do things like check to see if the ID was accidentally left blank, or perhaps the price or the quantity does not make sense for your system. So again, we're going to focus on the big picture view in this video, which means we want to take a quick look at some of the switches that we've already written, just so that you can remind yourself or see the purpose behind this application. And again, we're starting off with this products.csv. And so one of the things that we'd like to do is we would like to be able to search the product to see if we have a specific ID in our structure array, or think of it this way, in our inventory.csv file. And as a result, the first thing that we want to do is simply import the structures. We would like to display all of the structures or products, and then we can search for the ID field and look for a match that was provided, again, by our user. We can do the same thing with our name field as well as our type field, and we'll come back to the description field and how we can leverage that later. But we can also look at the price field, and in this case, we're going to be looking at a minimum and maximum value. And then in this case, we would simply import, again, our products, display them for convenience or confidence to the user that something is actually happening. Ultimately, we may pull this out because it does cause our application to be a little noisy. We'll search, in this case, by double. We copy over to a new array the results of our search, and then we simply export that as a results.csv file. And again, we can do this for our quantity. So again, this is meant to be an overview of the current state of our application. And hopefully you can see now how we can start using these pieces in a different order in conjunction with writing new code to then build a bigger and bigger system. So as always, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, don't hesitate to reach out to me. And hopefully you found this video or this overview useful. And thank you for watching.